Hello, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to week 4 of the Mental Health Mondays Wellness Series presented by Shift Posts. Today's topic is creating healthy thinking patterns. My name is Caitlin Lopes. I will be your host for the evening. After today's session, the video will be available for viewing on YouTube. And I want to bring your attention to the handouts section where you will find some tools and resources for cultivating healthy thinking patterns. Without further ado, I would like to thank you for joining us this evening and hope that you find the contents of tonight's webinar to be highly informative, and hope that it will support you in creating healthy thinking patterns and in supporting your mental health. Let's get started. So first we'll start by defining what healthy thinking is. So healthy thinking does not mean positive thinking. No one can look at things positively all of the time. Sometimes bad things happen, like a very bad day at work, having an argument with your partner, or losing someone that you love. And it's perfectly normal and healthy to feel upset and to have negative thoughts when things like that happen. What healthy thinking really means is looking at the entire situation, the positive aspects, the negative aspects, and the neutral parts, and then coming to a conclusion. In other words, healthy thinking means looking at life and the world in a balanced way, not through rose-colored glasses. Okay. So, part of what prevents us from having healthy thinking patterns are thinking traps. Thinking traps are negative reasoning patterns. You can imagine them as labyrinths in which your common sense and your ability to see things with perspective is hindered. So thinking traps prevent us from looking at things logically and calmly, and we become trapped in these cognitive distortions and emotional filters, which fuel unhappiness and dissatisfaction. Everyone has experienced these kinds of mental phenomena at some points of our lives or another. And these thinking traps tend to indicate that as a human being, you're a rational creature. Nevertheless, this image doesn't really fit in with our reality. We have a tendency to catastrophize things and to be very hard on ourselves. And this is because as human beings, we're emotional creatures who reason. And in fact, it's these emotions that dominate our ways of thinking and acting oftentimes. And sometimes we don't recognize that we're to blame for our own unhappiness. And this is because our mind isn't always objective or logical, and we often drift into a sort of sense of self-destruction. So let's take a closer look at some of these common thinking patterns. So the very first one that I want to talk to you about tonight is overgeneralizing. So overgeneralizing is thinking that a negative situation is part of a constant cycle of bad things that happen. Overgeneralization frequently affects people with depression or anxiety disorders, and it's a way of thinking where you apply one experience to all experiences, including those in the future. So, people who overgeneralize often use the words like always or never. So this always happens, or I'm never going to do that. And if you experience overgeneralization, you may view any negative experiences that happen to you as sort of a part of an inevitable pattern of mistakes, which is not necessarily true. A self-limiting overgeneralization is when you keep yourself from meeting your own potential. And these are very common thoughts like, I'm not good enough, or I could never do that. And those types of thoughts keep you from taking risks or next steps, and can even harm your career and your social life. So an example of an overgeneralization is, I always screw up speeches. I never can speak in public without messing up and looking foolish. Okay. Another negative thinking pattern or thinking trap is catastrophizing. So this trap involves imagining that the worst possible thing is about to happen and predicting that you won't be able to cope with it when it does happen. When in reality, the worst case scenario usually never happens, and even if it did, you'd probably be able to cope just fine. This cognitive distortion is also known as magnifying, and can also emerge as its opposite, which is minimizing. Magnifying occurs when you exaggerate the importance of insignificant events or the possible outcomes. And on the other hand, minimizing occurs when you incorrectly shrink the importance of significant events or any positive qualities until they seem small and insignificant. So that could be shrinking your accomplishments. And on the other hand, catastrophizing is just believing that the worst possible outcome is going to happen. You're going to not be able to pay your mortgage. You're going to lose your house. You're going to be homeless, something like that. So an example that I have here is my husband seemed irritated and was short with me today. He's going to divorce me and I will never find love or be happy again. The kids will blame me and never talk to me again. So in this example, we see that this is very exaggerated. It almost seems sort of dramatic, but these are real fears that we have. And this is just part of being human. But when we recognize that we're catastrophizing and thinking about something that is very unlikely to happen, it's important to take ourselves out of that thinking pattern. And we'll talk about how to do that a little bit later after we've gone through the other thinking traps. So, the next one that I want to talk about is black and white thinking. So, black and white thinking is seeing things as only right or wrong, only good or bad, only perfect or terrible. So, it's one or the other, there's no in between at all. And people who think in black and white uh, thinking patterns tend to see a very small mistake as a total failure. People who think this way see the world in very far extremes. And they typically make snap judgments which shape their opinions of themselves, others, and virtually everything else in the world. So, an example of this is I planned to eat only healthy foods, but today I ate a piece of chocolate. Now my diet is ruined forever. I will never be able to reach my goals. So, what you'll notice with a lot of these examples is that sometimes we have overlapping thinking traps, right? So, I will never be able to reach my goals is sort of predicting the future, which is another thinking trap that we'll talk about in a minute. And then you also see now my diet is ruined forever. It's sort of using that same type of thinking pattern, like the overgeneralizing, where you're applying one situation and assuming that it will be that way in perpetuity, right? Another thinking trap is labeling. So, labeling is saying only negative things about yourself or other people. It's often very narrow minded. An example of this is I made a mistake at work. I'm so stupid. My coworker Jim pointed out that I made a mistake. Jim is a total jerk. So we're labeling Jim as a jerk based on one piece of information that we have. We're seeing the situation very negatively. We're seeing ourselves very negatively by questioning our intelligence and saying, I'm so stupid, which probably isn't true. And everybody makes mistakes. So it's important to have patience and empathy for ourselves, especially when we make a mistake or when something bad happens in our lives. Another thinking trap is fortune telling. So, fortune telling occurs when we predict things that will turn out bad. I'm guilty of this. I do it all the time. I know lots of other people fall into this trap as well. When we believe that the future is already set in stone and negative, we often act like it is, which can be a self fulfilling prophecy once again. So, if we have the attitude that something bad is going to happen, then we're sort of, in a way, manifesting that something bad will happen because there's that saying that if you believe you can or you believe you can't, you're right. right? So it's really important to think about things in a more open and optimistic point of view. Again, we're aiming for balanced thinking in our thinking traps. So while we can acknowledge that something bad might happen, fortune telling that it will is a negative thinking trap and contributes to a low sense of self-esteem and overall poor mental health. So an example of this is I've been practicing my speech for the wedding, but I just know that it'll go horribly, right? We can't say that with confidence. And often, like I said, this reflects negative self esteem and a lack of confidence in our abilities. So it's important to be aware of. Next, mental filter. So, filtering involves only paying attention to the negative aspects of a situation while ignoring all of the positive aspects. When you focus only on the negatives, what you end up doing is viewing the entire situation as negative. And so you're in your mind, everything about it is negative. And this stops us from looking at the aspects of a situation which are positive and drawing a more balanced conclusion. So even when we fail, even when bad things happen in our lives, usually there's an opportunity to grow from it, to learn from it. They say that when one door closes, another one opens. There are a lot of instances in which good things come from bad situations, right? And even though that isn't always the case, again, it's important to be open to those possibilities, to point out those good things, and to acknowledge them. Right? An example of having a mental filter is saying something like, I met a lot of great people at the party, but Paul didn't talk to me. He must not like me. There must be something wrong with me. Okay. So even though the party was great, you had lots of fun, you talked to lots of people, you made lots of connections, you're hung up that this one small aspect of it didn't go 100% how you expected it to go. And now you're concerned that one of the individuals at the party doesn't like you, and that there's something wrong with you. So that's a negative thinking trap. Okay. Few more here. So we have emotional reasoning. So this type of thinking trap hijacks your rational mind and it becomes dominated by negative valence emotions like anger, sadness, and disappointment. Emotional reasoning is all about believing that bad feelings or emotions reflect the situation that we're in. And emotional reasoning causes you to fall into endless loops of suffering. For example, if you think something negative, then you feel bad, and then you feel bad because you're feeling bad, and you see reality through a lens of doom. And then you reinforce your fear so much more, and your mind is captivated by this tricky focus. Right? So, an example of emotional reasoning is I feel anxious when I fly, so airplanes must not be safe. Okay. Discounting the positives is another thinking trap. So, discounting the positives involves believing that positive things that happen to you don't count. Sort of seeing those positive things as a fluke or a mistake. So, an example of discounting the positives is my friend complimented me on the meal I made, but she was just being nice. And this is another one that I know I do a lot of the time, and I'm sure a lot of you guys are guilty of as well. Lastly, we have should statements. So, should statements are telling yourself how you should or must act. So, for example, I should be able to handle this without getting upset and crying. And often, should statements are the product of us being a little bit too hard on ourselves and a lack of awareness for the fact that we're human, we have emotions, we make mistakes, and that we're not perfect. And that's okay. All right. So, let's talk about how we can get out of a thinking trap. We talked about so many different kinds of them and examples, but how do we actually deal with them and how do we create productive, healthy thinking that promotes mental health, promotes confidence, and allows us to lead a more fulfilling and happy life? So, The very first thing that we should do to get out of a thinking trap is to separate our thoughts from actual events. So ask yourself the following questions when something upsetting happens. So, firstly, what is the situation and what actually happened? Is it true? If yes, has the circumstance actually happened before? And when you're answering this question, only include facts that everyone would agree on. So, really try to think about the situation objectively versus subjectively. So, what are the cold, hard facts? What happened? All right. Secondly, what are your thoughts? What are you telling yourself? So, based on what happened, what is the dialogue that you're relaying to yourself in your head about what happened? And sort of try to dissect those a little bit. Why might you be thinking those things? Okay. Next, what are your emotions? Emotions are a little bit different than thoughts. The thoughts could be in our example about going to the party and feeling like Paul doesn't like us because he didn't talk to us. The thought there is that, oh, there must be something wrong with me. But the emotion is really a lack of connection or sadness, right? So, an important question to ask yourself are, what are your emotions? How do you feel? And are you relying on logic or emotions when you're processing the situation or event that's happening? And lastly, ask yourself, have I ever been able to work through a similar situation? If yes, how did I do that? What were my behaviors? What did I do to cope? Right? Secondly, we want to identify the thinking traps. Now that we have awareness of what they are, we want to consider the thoughts and feelings that we're experiencing. And we want to ask ourselves if we're using any of the thinking traps and falling into these distorted, negative thinking patterns. It's very common to fall into more than one. Like I was saying earlier, sometimes they tend to overlap. And what's really important is to not try to get out of a thinking trap just by telling yourself that you should stop thinking that way, because that in itself is a thinking trap, right? That's those should statements, like I shouldn't feel this way. Okay. This doesn't help you look at the evidence and challenge the thinking trap. When you try and push the upsetting thoughts away, they're just more likely to keep popping up into your mind. We sort of need to address those thinking traps head on, do a little bit of dissection, and really explore why we feel that way. Okay. And the most important thing is to challenge the thinking traps. So we can do this using one of four strategies. We can employ multiple of these strategies. They're all really great for breaking down those thinking traps and challenging them in order to understand those thought patterns and get out of them. So the first is examining the evidence. So try to find evidence against the thought. If you made a mistake at work, you might automatically think, I can't do anything right. I must be a terrible employee. And when a thought like this comes up, you might challenge it by asking, is there any evidence to support that thought? Is there any evidence to disprove this thought? And in asking yourself that and examining the evidence and those cold, hard facts, you might quickly realize that your boss has complimented your work recently, which doesn't support the idea that you're a bad employee, or that your patients frequently commend you for going above and beyond as a pharmacist. And again, that doesn't support the idea that you're a bad employee. Okay? So just think about what has happened, what disproves that thought, and go from there. The second is a double standard. So, using the double standard strategy, you would ask yourself, would I judge other people if they did the same thing? Am I being harder on myself than I would be on other people. This is a really great method for challenging thinking traps that involve harsh self-criticism. Like I said earlier, we're often our hardest critics. We're very, very tough on ourselves and often much tougher than we would be on other people. So really consider that double standard and see if perhaps the self-criticism is a little too harsh indeed. Next, we have the survey method. So in the survey method, we want to find out whether other people you trust agree with your thoughts. So this could be your friends, your family, anyone who supports you, loves you, who wants the best for you, and who knows you well. So, for instance, if we use the survey method, you might be having trouble with one of your kids and think, well, good parents wouldn't have this kind of problem, right? And to challenge that thought, you might ask your friend, who's also a parent, if they've ever had any problems with their kids, right? And by asking that question to your friend who's a parent, you might quickly learn that they too have many trials and tribulations with parenting. They might share some of the same emotions that you're feeling. Their children might also be difficult. And you might realize that it's not a you thing and it's not that you're a bad parent, but rather that this is just a part of the process of parenting and that many other people experience the same sort of emotions and challenges. And lastly, another great strategy is the conducting an experiment strategy, which involves testing your beliefs in person. So, for example, if you think that your friends don't care about you, call a few friends and make plans to get together. If you assumed that they would all say no, you might be pleasantly surprised to hear that they do want to see you and spend time with you and that they're excited by this proposition. So that is testing that thinking trap and proving it wrong. So the most important point here is that we're aiming for balance in our thoughts. So let's look at an example here. A very, very simple one, but it shows us how we can really transform those thinking patterns and turn them into healthier ones. So, in our example, your friend Tom didn't text you back right away. So you think, he's so rude, he must not like me anymore. So, we want to identify the thinking patterns. So, analyzing our thoughts, analyzing our feelings, what thinking traps are we falling into? Well, we're falling into labeling and mind reading, right? And then we're going to challenge our thinking trap. So, the strategy that we use is examining the evidence. Well, Tom has never been rude to you in the past, and I'm not sure if he even has his phone with him, right? And then by examining the evidence, we can come to a more balanced conclusion. There could be many reasons why he didn't text. Maybe he's busy and can't check his phone, or maybe his battery died. So maybe you want to wait until the next time you meet before you jump to any negative conclusions about the friendship, right? So this is taking more of the focus and attention off of you, removing that self-criticism that, oh, he doesn't like me, something must be wrong with me, there must be something wrong with our friendship, and recognizing that there are many, many factors as to why someone might not respond to you right away. And this type of strategy and thinking path can be applied to many, many different situations, right? The main point here is once you've worked through the challenges and you've thought and you've reached a more balanced thought, you want to use that balanced thinking to replace old thinking traps. Oh, are all negative thoughts unhealthy thinking traps? The answer is no. There are times when our negative thoughts are realistic. Some negative situations jeopardize our safety, our health, or the well being of others that we care about. It's important to remember that we're not looking at situations with rose colored glasses through healthy thinking. Instead, we are keeping in mind that part of healthy thinking involves risk assessment and balancing realistic thoughts with unrealistic thoughts. So, really working to find that middle ground. Even when negative thoughts are realistic and a situation does prove to potentially be a negative one, it can still be helpful to find different ways of looking at that situation. And I encourage you to try your best to find a meaningful personal challenge in challenging or emotionally taxing situations. So see if you can find any opportunities at all for personal growth or for skill development as you move through rough patches or tough situations. Many people who are dealing with difficult situations find that their upsetting thoughts improve when they work on other coping skills, such as identifying the main sources of stress in their lives, problem solving issues that they can control, finding social support, and building other skills which support them to be more resilient. And here I've provided some sources and additional resources for you. So if you are interested in seeking out additional help or reading more about um, healthy thinking patterns, these are some great resources for you. As I mentioned at the beginning of this session, there's also the handout section, which has some valuable resources as well, which I encourage you to check out, some worksheets which will help you to really challenge your unhealthy thinking patterns and cultivate healthier ways of approaching situations. And with that, we have reached the end of our session tonight. On behalf of everyone at Shift Posts, thank you so much for joining us. I have loved having you here this evening, and I hope that you found the content of this webinar to be highly valuable. I hope that it allows you to build some skills which you can take with you in your personal and professional life to cultivate healthier thinking patterns. And I look forward to having you join us for our upcoming events in the future. Thank you so much and have a wonderful evening.